Hello guys. This is my presentation on Claude Monet and exploring Expressionism in the 19th century. Just to show you guys a little sort of table of contents, I'm going to do an overview, kind of an intro, timeline, and background. I'm going to put it all in context. I'm going to show you guys some of his work and then talk a little bit about his present day legacy. So moving into the intro, Oscar Claude Monet was a French painter widely credited as one of the founding fathers of the Impressionist art movement that swept through middle-class French communities beginning in the 1860s. He was the most consistent and prolific practitioner of the movement's main philosophy of expressing one's perceptions before nature. Just to show a little timeline of events of pretty significant moments in Monet's life. Obviously on November 14th, 1840, Monet was born in the 9th arrondissement in Paris. For those who are unfamiliar, Paris is divided up into 20 of these numbered neighborhoods arranged in kind of like a spiral shape, starting at the heart of the city. And so the 9th of these neighborhoods, otherwise known as Opera, its formal name, sits on the right bank of the River Seine and is currently known for its many theaters and opera houses, as the name would suggest. So Monet was born there as the second son of Claude Adolphe and Louise Justine Aubray Monet, both second-generation Parisians. He was baptized as a Catholic in 1841, but would eventually come to identify as an atheist later in life. Fast forwarding 10 years from that, on April 1st, 1851, young Monet entered a secondary art school in Le Havre. I think I'm saying that right. He quickly became known amongst the locals for his charcoal caricatures, which he would sell for 20 francs. And then in 1857, on January 28th, Monet left school to live in Paris with his aunt upon the death of his mother. When Monet traveled to visit the Louvre in Paris, the world's largest art museum, he noticed painters copying from their old masters, and Monet, having brought his own like paints and other tools with him, would instead just go and like sit by a window and paint what he saw. And Monet was in Paris for several years and met several painters who would become friends and later fellow Impressionists. And then in 1864, Monet had his first few paintings accepted at the official salon, which is an exposition where prominent artists at the time would enter their masterpieces to be judged, and if accepted, sold and offered for sale at auction. So to the 19th century aspiring French artist, success at the salon kind of meant the possibility of being able to learn a living as an artist, or earn a living as an artist, excuse me, which was kind of a big deal. So, but by 1980 or 1874, Monet had turned his back on the official salon and formed his own exposition, where he debuted one of his most famous paintings, Impression Sunrise, which was the inspiration for the name of the artistic movement he would later help perpetuate. Then in 1980, Monet was recognized as France's premier painter, far surpassing any of his fellow Impressionist colleagues, at which point he was able to retire to his lush garden home in Giverny. Despite his failing eyesight, he painted almost up until his death at the age of 86 in 1926. So diving a little bit deeper into sort of his early life, his childhood, in 1845, when Monet was around 5 years old, his family moved to Le Havre in Normandy, just northwest of Paris. His father adamantly wanted him to go into the family business. They had like a grocery store and a ship chandling business, which is like providing equipment and supplies for ships. But Monet didn't want to do that. He desperately wanted to become an artist, and his mother was a singer, and she was therefore much more supportive of Claude's creative endeavors. But the young Monet was described as rebellious and daring. That pattern of assertive rebellion would stay with him, for upon Monet's mother's untimely death in 1857, Claude decided he was going to formally pursue painting in Paris. His father was not happy about this. He refused to support him financially in any capacity, so the adolescent Monet was kind of forced to fend for himself and found solace and shelter in the home of his widowed aunt, Marie-Jeanne Lecadre. And then once he was in Paris, he refused any academic art training, choosing instead to work independently with other young artists such as Pissarro and Renoir, with whom he would remain connected for many years. They also became successful Impressionists. Moving on to his personal family affairs, Monet would take 2 wives over the course of his lifetime. In 1864, Monet met a woman who would eventually become his first wife and mother to both of his 2 sons. Her name was Camille Danseau. At the time, he was 24 and she 18, and they wasted no time in moving in together in Paris. Shortly after the birth of their first son, Jean, they relocated to Argenteuil, a commune in the northwestern suburbs of Paris. It's about like a 20-minute train ride outside of Paris. And there, Camille played the role of typical middle-class housewife of the time, rising early to serve breakfast to her husband and son, shopping, buying bread just before lunch, cleaning the house, preparing dinner, and reading the daily newspaper, all that good stuff. And Monet spent his time painting by the shore of the river near their home, occasionally accompanied by any number of his Impressionist buddies. And Camille was the subject of many of his paintings over the course of their relationship. Pictured here is actually a piece by Monet of Camille on her deathbed. Unfortunately, Camille fell ill after the birth of their second son, Michael, and would die just under a year and a half later in 1879. And soon after that, Monet made the acquaintance of Alice Hochet, a woman who was at the time already married and a mother to 7 children, one of whom actually, her name was Blanche, would eventually marry Claude's son, Jean. Just a fun fact. But so she had 7 kids. The couple moved in together and would eventually relocate to Giverny, where Monet would nurture a large garden that would become the subject of his paintings for the remainder of his life. So here Alice is pictured, albeit pretty vaguely, in an 1883 painting titled Lunch Under the Canopy. All right, so putting Impressionism in historical context, ultimately Impressionism was an artistic movement that brought kind of a new understanding of color, light, and optics to the scene. Impressionism or Impressionists of the time were kind of breaking all of the rules of academic painting, of what art was at the time. So in the second half of the 19th century, an impressionistic still life appeared that determined the direction of development of the genre of the 20th century. Impressionist floral still life paintings presented not images of flowers, but the process of flowering, the effects of the colors, so that they are deprived of material substance. In still life paintings of the Impressionists, an object is elevated to a higher degree, but at the same time, it has lost its sense of materiality. And the Impressionists originally called themselves the Anonymous Society of Artists, Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers. And the story of how they eventually came to call themselves Impressionists is actually kind of funny, because initially Impressionists were met with a certain degree of criticism from fellow artists and art critics. So on April 25th, 1874, you'll recall 1874 is the year that Monet hosted his first exposition for his work and all of his Impressionist friends' work. So on April 25th, 1874, the art critic Louis Leroy published a satirical piece in the journal Charivari that described a visit to the exposition by an official, like, fictional artist. So as he moves from one painting to the next, the artist slowly goes insane. He criticizes the surface of a painting by Camille Pissarro, describing the plowed fields as shavings from an artist's palette carelessly deposited onto a soiled canvas. When looking at the painting, he is unable to tell top from bottom or left from right. He is horrified by Monet's landscape entitled Boulevard de Capucine. In Leroy's satire, it's actually Monet's work that pushes the fictional artist kind of over the edge. Stopping in front of one of the Le Havre landscapes, he asks what impression sunrise depicts, and he's quoted as saying, "Impression, of course. I said so myself, too, because I am so impressed. There must be some impression in here. And what freedom, what technical ease." At which point he begins to dance a jig in front of the paintings, exclaiming, "Hey ho! I'm a walking impression. I'm an avenging palette knife." Leroy called this satirical article the exhibition of the Impressionists, unknowingly coining a new word from the painting's title, Impression Sunrise, a word that was so fitting that it was kind of destined to remain forever in the vocabulary of the history of art that we still use to this day. So that's just kind of a funny origin story, I think. And even later, in the 1890s, Paul Gauguin, a celebrated post-impressionist artist, described his frustrating encounters with impressionist painters and their inability to go beyond what he termed as the slavish representation of atmospheric effects on color. He's quoted as saying, "Then came the Impressionists. They studied color, and color alone, as a decorative effect, but they did so without freedom, remaining bound by the shackles of verisimilitude. For them, there is no such thing as a landscape that has been dreamed, created from nothing. They looked and they saw harmoniously, but without any goal. They did not build their edifice on any sturdy foundation of reasoning as to why feelings are perceived through color. They focused their efforts around the eye, not in the mysterious center of thought." So, reading that quote, to dissect it a little bit, he's criticizing Impressionists for their emphasis on observation, and replicating what they see. Because that was one of the big sort of pillars of Impressionism. So he's criticizing like their inability to use creative license and add sort of any sort of abstraction to it, and claiming that that makes it devoid of sort of intent. So I just thought that was an interesting criticism of Impressionism at the time. So yeah, Impressionists initially were not greeted with like open arms. They were kind of the rebels of the art community, if you could say that. And so here I've compiled just a couple of quotes from Claude Monet that I feel kind of showcase his general philosophy surrounding art that aligns with the base components of what would eventually become the Impressionist movement. So this first one here, he says, "I perhaps owe having become a painter to flowers." Impressionism as an art movement relies heavily on nature as its subject matter. So his gravitation toward flowers demonstrates this heavily. Almost all of his paintings either include or entirely center around flowers or foliage of some kind. And if not, the persons or shapes present in his artwork still convey, a feeling that implies an organic inspiration. You can tell like that was the inspiration behind it, even if there's not, it's not just a painting of a of a vase of flowers. You can tell the intent behind it. And then the second quote, "The richness I achieve comes from nature, the source of my inspiration." Again, emphasis put upon nature speaks to Impressionism's main philosophy of open composition and a focus on impression and expression rather than exact precision. Painting outdoors or anywhere that allows a natural, constantly shifting light source to be a factor in the composition of the piece abides by kind of the fundamental ideas that Impressionism drove at the time. And then this last one, "Everyone discusses my art and pretends to understand as if it were necessary to understand when it is simply necessary to love." And I really like this quote because it's just such an artist thing to say. Um, but I think that this quote exemplifies the core pillars of Impressionism because it places the stress on how the art makes the viewer feel rather than um, really the accuracy of the depiction. Realism is not really the ideal. It certainly can be included in the genre of art, but giving the artist best impression of the scene before him or her is the primary goal. Um, and dissecting each aspect of the piece makes one kind of lose sight of, or like for lack of a better phrase, the bigger picture, which is ultimately an overall impression or feeling evoked by the artwork. Um, so dissecting some of the like core, like main pillars that support the Impressionist movement. So obviously there's the subject matter, what the work is of or about. And Impressionism centers itself around a foundation of nature. Still life paintings and landscape make up a vast majority of Impressionist paintings of the time period. And light. Light in art is an applied art form that focuses on how shadows, highlights, and reflections interact with the subject. And this is a big thing. This is like the main like central pillar of Impressionism, I think, because at the time before Impressionism, all painting was typically done indoors in some sort of studio. Even like the landscape paintings were all done inside. Um, and Impressionism was kind of the first time people started to paint on plein air, which is just a French way of saying painting outside, um, because it fixates so heavily on natural light and how time passing changes um, how you view um, a subject. Because of the changing angles and light source, there's a heavy emphasis on the angle of light and shadow in Impressionism. So light is a huge thing. And then style. You typically know an Impressionist painting right when you see one. Um, Style is the distinctive matter of expression, and Impressionist paintings are characterized by, not always, but usually characterized by small, thin, yet still visible brushstrokes. They're typically very colorful, and not usually, sometimes, but not usually, like hyper realistic. It's meant to evoke actual emotion rather than just awe at the skill of the artist. And then here I have another quote from Monet, um, describing the way that he personally approaches painting. And I really like this quote because he so succinctly summarizes kind of the fundamental ideas that drove the Impressionist movement in just this little couple of sentences. But he said, try to forget what objects you have before you, a tree, a house, a field, or whatever. Merely think, here is a little square of blue, here an oblong of pink, here a streak of yellow, and paint it just as it looks to you until it gives you your own naive impression of the scene before you. And I think this quote is very interesting to me, speaking as a person who has taken several art classes over the course of my life, because this is art advice that you still hear it today. Um, Ignore what you think you see, paint what you actually see is a mantra that I've heard repeated by many creatives that I admire and respect a great deal. Um, so I'm not sure if he's the sole originator of this little snippet of art advice, but I just think it's so cool that this sentiment is still being echoed all these years later. But this is just him describing how he approaches his artwork. So I just thought that that was a cool snippet. I got that from the textbook actually. So where was Impressionism prevalent in its heyday? Currently, we have the ability to appreciate the masterpieces of the Impressionists in all corners of the world. But at the time, it originated in and was relatively limited to the confines of France. Um, Most, if not all, of the most recognizable names in Impressionist circles are of French origin. Monet, obviously the most accomplished Impressionist of his time, began the movement in Paris along with a slew of his fellow devoted creators. Um, In the decades following the movement's birth and approaching the height of Monet's career, though, the movement of Impressionism experienced some praise from the press, not only in other countries in Western Europe, but across the Atlantic and America. Namely, museums in Chicago purchased a number of Monet's paintings for display. So it did experience some spread during Monet's lifetime. It was not strictly limited to France, except for in the first couple of decades. And speaking of all these other French Impressionists of the time, Monet had a lot of buddies that he would paint he would either paint right with them, or he would they would kind of do these interesting, like, what's an example I would draw to today. They would do paintings of like the same landscape, or they would title paintings the same thing as kind of like a way to communicate or challenge each other back and forth, which I think is really interesting. So Monet was probably the most successful of this handful, but he had plenty of colleagues. So there's Camille Pissarro, Edouard Manet, who actually, it's funny, they didn't like each other at first, Monet and Manet, because they would get confused so often. So they were kind of enemies, but turned friends. And then Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, Henri Matisse, and Paul Cézanne. So these were the big names of the time, and most of these are household names to this day. And then getting into sort of the meat and potatoes of the presentation is obviously we have to look at some of Monet's work. So these are probably his, at least I think, his most famous pieces, these two. So on the left here we have this piece titled Bridge Over a Pond of Water Lilies. And water lilies are like what you think of when you think of Monet, at least most people. That was what he, that was the subject of a lot of his paintings, and this is, I think, the most significant one of his garden in Giverny, where he retired and would eventually pass away in 1926. So this beautiful sort of water lilies under a bridge. And you can see, like, as I was talking about, like, the style, these, like, short, visible brush strokes, almost sort of reminiscent of Van Gogh, but not quite. You can see, like, even in the reflection of the water, there's all these little colors. It's not an exact representation. It's not, you wouldn't look at this and be like, oh, that's a photo, but you get a feeling from it. You get, like, this is Monet's impression of this landscape. And then over to the right here, we have, this is Impression Sunrise. This was the inspiration for the name of the movement. This was this was the painting that angered that satire author so much, Leroy. So yeah, this debuted at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874 in Paris. And would eventually inspire the name of the movement. So it's pretty cool. Some other famous pieces. On the left, we have the poppy field near Argenteuil. This is a poppy field near Monet and Camille's house in Argenteuil. He painted, I believe, he did 4 separate pieces of the same poppy field. And he's really celebrating his love of flowers here. And then on the right, we have another Argenteuil painting. These were both in the decade or so that him and Camille lived in Argenteuil. But this is a picture of, it's one of the few occasions that Monet decided to demonstrate his skill as a figure painter, which wasn't too often. But this image depicts Camille and their son Jean frolicking through a field in the summer of 1875. And it's generally believed that Monet intended the work to convey a feeling of a casual family outing rather than like a formal portrait. You see that it almost kind of looks like, if this were like an image that someone were to take, it looks like, they're not posing, they're kind of just, it's kind of more of a candid, which I think is interesting. It's not like overly, like I said, it's not overly formal. And he used pose and placement to suggest that his wife and son interrupted their stroll while he captured their likenesses. And then a couple more we have on the left, um, Luncheon on the Grass from 1866. This is actually a fragment of a piece that was started in the spring of 1865 and originally measured about 13 by 20 feet. It was like this giant piece that Monet was working on that was intended to be both a tribute and a challenge to Manet, whose painting of the same title had been the subject of much sarcasm from the public as well as the critics when it was exhibited in the official salon in 1863. But he abandoned the project in 1866, just before the salon where Monet intended to show it opened. Um, so it wasn't finished, so it was eventually kind of segmented into different little vignettes. Um, and this is one of the most popular ones. Um, and then the one on the right is from 1869. It's Bon à la Grenouillère, if I'm saying that correctly, which just means the baths of La Grenouillère, which is this little structure here. Monet painted this scene directly alongside Pierre Auguste Renoir. They were both exceptionally poor artists working at the time, and they hoped to capitalize off this sort of picturesque image of wealth and leisure because the middle class was kind of their target audience. So they wanted to sell paintings. So they were like, let's paint you know, kind of an image of grandeur, this calm little frame. And so this is like I've come to understand this is like a floating restaurant. I think this is La Grenouillère, and then this is what they call Flower Pot Island or Camembert. Um, so yeah, this is like a floating restaurant that they painted. Um, and there's obviously a Renoir version of this painting because they painted, I think, from the same vantage point, which I thought was really interesting. Um, and then I wanted to show you guys a couple of side-by-side comparisons. These are three different paintings from the decade leading up to Monet being recognized as France's premier painter. That was in 1890. And I think comparisons like these are really fascinating. Being able to see the development of an artist's style or focus during both a period of success and struggle, I think allows for kind of a deeper understanding of the artist. Um, I like how the development of his color palette is so apparent in these three pieces. The colors progress from fairly muted over here at the Senate Lava Court, fairly muted to a more vibrant and sort of expressive as he grows as an artist. Almost like, I like to think of it almost like a crescendo to what would be kind of like the highlight of his artistic career. So I just think this is a cool visual to look at side by side. We have kind of, you know, more realistic, kind of dull to a more stylistic and vibrant and kind of just a landscape in the middle here. So 1880 to 1888, eventually he is recognized in 1890. And then here, like I said, I think it's interesting to see them in times in both success and struggle. So here is kind of a opposite evolution of his work. From the decade where Monet really struggled with some loss of eyesight, which is kind of an artist's worst nightmare. Starting around 1912, Monet started to develop cataracts in his eyes, which would only worsen over the course of the next 10 years, reaching a peak in 1922 that would eventually push him to opt for corrective surgery to remove the cataracts. So to the very left is a piece he did right at the beginning of the decline. The image is still recognizable, but it just doesn't have a great deal of intricate detail like we had seen in some of his other pieces. The color palette is pretty limited, just primary colors. And the forms are relatively pretty simple. And then in the middle we have another water lily piece, painted approximately in the middle of his issues with his eyesight. The color palette is even more muted and limited here, just a lot of greens. And we can see the composition of his pieces are beginning to become more and more sort of uninvolved. Um, Still a beautiful and ultimately impressive painting by all means, but in comparison to some of his other works, it's, I think, definitely a little underwhelming. And then to the very right, we have a piece done at the height of Monet's struggles with his eyesight. Um, Personally, I think it's immediately apparent how much this piece differs from the rest of Monet's works. I think if a person who knew very little about Monet was given his portfolio and was asked to pick which piece was painted at the peak of his blindness, I don't think it would be hard to single out this one here. Um, Not that this piece isn't enrapturing in its own unique way, but the contrast is pretty stark. Um, and the color palette is a lot harsher. It almost looks like it's on fire, kind of. Um, and if not for the title of the piece, it's not even immediately recognizable as a footbridge. Um, the implication of the form is there. You know, you can kind of see like this here, and then like some rails, and maybe the handrail here. But overall, it takes some concentrated deciphering. And then eventually, after his surgery, his eyesight greatly improved. But I just thought this particular decade of Monet's career, 1912 to 1922, was pretty interesting to behold, to say the least. And then moving on to his legacy immediately after death, and then sort of how we think of him present day. So, for a number of years after Monet's death, he was only known in select circles of art lovers. Um, the major renaissance of his work actually occurred in New York by the abstract expressionists. Artists like Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock and critics such as Clement Greenberg learned much from Monet's large canvases and semi-abstract all-over compositions. Pop artists also referred to Monet's haystacks in pieces, like Andy Warhol's repeating portraits. Similarly, many minimalists use the same technique in their serial display of objects. Impressionism and Monet are actually now considered the basis for all modern and contemporary art, and are thus quintessential to almost any historical survey. And Monet's extraordinarily long life and large artistic output, approximately, I think, around 2,500 paintings, befit the enormity of his contemporary popularity. Impressionism, for which he is obviously a main pillar, continues to be one of the most popular artistic movements, as evidenced by its massive popular mainstream consumption today, in the form of like calendars, postcards, posters. You know, you've all gone to Barnes and Noble and seen like a Monet journal or something, or a water lily journal. But nowadays, Monet paintings command top prices at auction, and some are even considered priceless by some appraisers. Monet's work is in every museum worldwide, and his works are now canonized, which means it refers to a process in which specific aspects of culture are kind of established as crucial or of the utmost importance. And then just some statistics. Approximately 500,000 people travel to visit Monet's garden in Giverny each year to witness firsthand the environment Monet was so inspired by in the early 1900s, and almost 395 people, 395,000 people, so almost 400,000 people went to see Monet's exhibit at the Denver Art Museum between October 2019 and February 2020, so like 6 months, almost 400,000 people went to go see his work. It just shows how people still show up for this. People still love his work, and he's still widely popular not only in his home country of France, but over here in Colorado. It's just so widespread. And some places that you can go see his work. I chose the top three of the largest collections of his work. But we have the Musée d'Orsay, which is a giant museum inside of an old train station in Paris, actually. They have approximately like 90 works-ish, including the painting of the poppy field near Argenteuil. We have the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. They have a decent collection of about 400 works of Monet, including the bridge over a pond of water lilies that I showed you guys. And then lastly, we have the Musée Marmottan Monet. And as the name would suggest, the museum has the largest collection of Monet pieces in the world. This is also located in Paris. And it houses the works of some artists too. It's not just a Monet museum, but it's mostly, he's the star of the show. But this is where Impression Sunrise is, that first painting. But fun fact about Impression Sunrise in this museum, on October 27th, 1985, during daylight hours, 5 masked gunmen with pistols threatening security and visitors entered the museum and stole 9 paintings from the collection, including Impression Sunrise. They stole Impression Soleil Levant by Claude Monet. And in total, all of the stolen paintings were valued at around $12 million, which is kind of insane. 12 million for 9 paintings, so that's over $1 million per painting. But a tip-off led to the arrest in Japan of a Yakuza gangster named, I'm gonna butcher this, named Shunichi Fujikuma, who had spent time in French prison for trafficking heroin and was sentenced for 5 years. In Fujikuma's house, police found a catalog with all the stolen paintings from the museum circled. They also found were 2 paintings by Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, stolen in 1984 from a different museum in France. And this eventually led to the recovery of the stolen paintings in a small villa in Corsica in December 1990. So everything was recovered, but they were stolen in 1985 and returned. But that concludes my presentation, you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at my school email. And here is my works cited for my the bulk of the information in the presentation, and then all of the images that I used. So thanks for listening.